anthropology professor with very broad interests. He happened to have been the founder, actually, of the anthropology department at McMaster, Richard Slobodian, who suggested to me relevant social science books and articles in fields such as religion, sociology, and political science that threw light on the broader culture and social context out of which these literary texts arose. I had, fortunately, the support of my department in launching 2 undergraduate courses and a graduate course in Francophone African and Caribbean literature as early as 1972. A sabbatical year spent in Senegal, 1973-74, gave me my first direct experience on the African continent. There I met with writers like Sendan Usman, Kamara Lai, Sheikh Ali Ndao, and I met with professors at the University of Dakar. One of my children was actually born in Dakar during that sabbatical leave at the Clinique Moyer in Dakar. I followed up with a 2-year leave of absence in Sierra Leone, 1977-79, where I served as the country director of the QSO program, used to be called Canadian University Service Overseas, overseeing about 30 Canadians working as doctors, nurses, teachers, agricultural specialists. And one of the things I'm proud of is that in Sierra Leone, I launched the first, what they call, host national volunteers. That is to say, not bringing in people from Canada, but Sierra Leoneans. So 2 Sierra Leoneans, and we launched this host national volunteer program, and they were assigned to lead a Freire-inspired functional adult literacy program that I helped to develop. So in 1972, there were no other black courses, at least in the Faculty of Humanities at the time. For my first black graduate student, it provided an opportunity for him to deepen his interest and knowledge in issues of black identity, historical experience, and current challenges. His master's thesis set out to study Aimé Césaire's theater, and I quote, in terms of the interaction of race and politics, and in the context of the anti-colonial and independence struggles of black peoples. He credits the study of this literature with inspiring the long career he subsequently had in intergovernmental relations in education and training, including his leading an educational project in South Africa. My predominantly white undergraduate students in my courses at the time got introduced to worlds of black experience with which they were largely unfamiliar. One of those students mentioned that through elementary and secondary school in the 60s and early 70s, she never heard anything about Africa or the African diaspora mentioned in her school curriculum. That was still the case for my own children in secondary school in the 1980s. Now a writer herself, this one student wrote to me saying, I quote, as a writer, I talk about arts and culture, and have made it a principle to incorporate artists and works from African nations as much as I'm able to in my work. Our paths actually crossed again many years later as she collaborated with an African musician in launching a black music festival in Hamilton. I was fortunate to have the support of my department in making that pivot. I later pivoted to international development and became, in 1988, the founding director of McMaster International, since renamed the Office of International Affairs, led by our colleague and good friend, Bonnie Ibawo, of whom we are very proud. I offer my experience as encouragement that we can successfully follow our deepest interests in the academy and in the world. I recently read a fascinating book on cosmology, published in 2022, the appendix of which included timelines on the evolution of matter, of the cosmic system, and of the human species. I was struck, this is 2022, I was struck by the absence of Africa from this chronology, with no reference to Africa between the origins of Homo sapiens in Africa and the colonization of Africa. No mention of the ancient Nubian kingdom of Kush, or the Ghana, Mali, or Songhai empires. So erasure of black presence, achievements, and identity continues. It continues also in the current attacks on critical race theory, in the book bannings, in the anti-affirmative action efforts, and the elimination or sidelining of equity, diversity, and inclusion offices. Now, more than ever, Black studies needs to be promoted and expanded to ensure that the light shines brightly on Black experience and achievements, past and present, and to counteract the current assertiveness of systems of colonial control and domination. Conferences like this one on Black Futurities, Reimagining Black Studies, have an important role to play in asserting the Black presence in and invaluable contributions to the world. I wish you an engaging and successful conference. Thank you. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Werner, for presenting our land acknowledgements and for your introductory remarks. We are always happy to have you around. Your lived experience and insight has been a valuable being for us to follow. Thank you for your service. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, my name is Hosea Patrick, and I will be your anchor for today's August event. We would like to thank our sponsors and partners, AgFarm, BSSC, the Provost Office, our vendor, Afrolicious, the DJ, our very own Dr. Rhonda, our volunteers for all your help and support. I also want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for the sacrifice of your time. We also want to remind everyone in attendance that the bathrooms are just, when you just walk outside, just by your right, if you need to use the restroom. Snacks and coffee are also available outside. And to connect with the ABLD program, this conference, online, you can use the hashtag ABLD@MAC, ABLD@MAC. So to continue the event, we are going to start with the first panel, panel one, and we'll be looking at defining Black studies, reflecting on intellectual genealogies. Beginning with that, we'll collectively identify and grapple with the theories and intellectual traditions that are anchoring and shaping current developments in Black Canadian studies. You can find the bios of our moderators and panelists in the conference program. We will now turn over to our moderator, Dr. Ronald Cummings, to begin the discussion. Dr. Ronald, please a round of applause for him as he comes.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I invite my panelists to join me. Okay, I wanted to start with a few words just to sort of anchor our discussion, and then we'll move into some questions and conversations. Let me just say the names of the people on the stage with me, but I'm also going to give them the chance to introduce themselves and to talk about how they're situated in and their histories in relationship to Black studies. So right next to me is Dr. Pablo Herrera Veitia, who's at University of Toronto, and
Phiona.
Phiona Lloyd-Henry, who's also at University of Toronto. There are a number of University of Toronto people on this panel. And next to Phiona is Dr. Janelle Joseph. And joining us virtually is Dr. Syrus Marcus Ware, who's my colleague here at McMaster University. Can we just give a round of applause to them? So I want to begin the conversation and thinking about this question of intellectual genealogies by invoking a question asked by an audience member in a recent conversation between the Jamaican novelist and sociologist Erna Brodber and the Jamaican writer Kai Miller. And this occurred 2 days ago. So Brodber has been one of the people who has been thinking long and hard about the question of emancipation and grappling with it as a complex question rather than an event. And indeed, in thinking about intellectual, but also political genealogies, we can look at Ronaldo Walcott's work in his book, Long Emancipation, in relation to Brodber's long thinking on this question. So the audience member, on being given the microphone, asked, how does one know one is emancipated? Or at what point are you, or how do you know at what point you are in the journey? What else may need to be done? Broadbent, in response, evokes the question of genealogy, asking us to consider and think of emancipation as processual. So according to Broadbent, and I'm quoting her here, an emancipated person can make the link respectfully between themselves, them grandmother, and them great-grandmother. This is one of the things, reclaiming yourself and your connection with past people. And I thought I'd bring that into the conversation here this morning for a number of reasons. So one, Broadbent is asking us to think about this question of genealogy, but also to think about intellectual knowledge is also what we bring into the university with us. And I also wanted to situate that as part of the discussion we might have this morning as well. But I also want to reference a number of Canadian thinkers who have been thinking complexly about genealogy. I'm thinking here about Norbesi Phillips' work and a book like A Genealogy of Resistance, or her work, Harriet's Daughter, right? Here she's thinking about matrilineal legacies and how they also orient us to the world. But we might also think about Christina Sharp's work in the wake as asking us to think through some of these questions. So I'm going to go through some questions that we've been asked to respond to today, and then we can have a conversation. So in terms of the questions we've been asked, or we've asked folks to reflect on, so we begin with asking folks to tell us a little bit about themselves as a way of orienting us, but also opening up and engaging this question about intellectual genealogies. So we can start here.
You want to start with me? Janelle, you want to start?
Oh, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Janelle Joseph, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. I entered into kinesiology as a sibling and daughter of athletes, not identifying as an athlete myself. And yet I am an athlete. I'm a capoeirista, and I used capoeira as my intellectual hook in order to explore what I saw was missing from my kinesiology undergraduate, master's, and PhD education. So that gives you a bit of the background. A bit about me is that I learned much of what I knew about transatlantic slavery from my capoeira mestres and my communities of Afro-Brazilians in the city of Toronto. I run a research lab. I'm the founder and director of the IDEAS Research Lab. IDEAS is an acronym that stands for Indigeneity, Diaspora, Equity, and Anti-Racism in Sport. And my research falls under those 4 pillars, but mainly with respect to Black studies, what I do is think about diaspora and the ways that our Canadian stories are always connected to these other Black geographies. And I've done research on Afro-Brazilian martial arts as well as cricket in the Greater Toronto area and its connections to the broader diaspora. And I've also been working in anti-racism in college and university sport in Canada. So I've run the biggest studies to date that looks at Black student athletes, coaches, administrators, and also Black sport entrepreneurs and their connections to their universities and colleges and their leading transformations in the equity space on our campuses.
Beautiful. Something you said about what Erna Broadbent talked about sort of is helping to orient me as I think through my response. So my name's Phiona, and I'm a PhD student at OISE. And when I'm not studying, I'm an educator. I'm a coordinating principal in leadership and capacity building at the Peel District School Board. But a long time ago, I used to be a department head of English, and a lot of the work that I do now is to work with not just educators, but with students as well. One of our most recent projects is the development of a Black Literatures course for high school students. We started by having 35 students, Black students from across the board, come to us at the central office and help to construct this course. You know, what they would like to see in the course, what they'd like to study, how they'd like to be assessed, what types of activities and so on would be built into this course. One of the things that we found when we started looking at culturally responsive pedagogy and how we may teach English differently in our board was that even when you brought in books written by and about Black authors, that these are often, I like to just say, slathered in snow. So people just teach it, the character happens to be Black, but nothing else changes in the approach that we use to teach it. So we look, right, so it doesn't change. It's the same sorts of activities, same sorts of things that people do, and so it doesn't change at all. Like the fabric of the course doesn't change. We wanted to be able to have students see themselves reflected, see their experiences reflected, see the totality of themselves. So not just like, you know, any sort of hegemonic Blackness or any sort of Blackness as one thing, as any sort of monolithic thing, but as homogeneous, you know, as broad and as expansive as possible. And not just Black folks from the quote unquote West, but Black African students, Black students from the Caribbean, right? First generation, third generation Blackness. So we wanted something that was broad. And that has been a really beautiful project to get Black students to be able to connect to each other, both in how they're alike, but also in how they're different. And so that has been amazing. We're in the process now of working with the Ontario College of Teachers to develop an AQ course for teachers to take on how they may also teach this Black Literatures course. So I love doing that.
Can we have the person online rather than leave them to? I don't know. I don't want to go last. I'd like to go last, but I mean,
That's okay.
is that okay? I mean,
That's
I think
okay.
usually it feels like people who are outside. I want her to feel like this inside already. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So my name is Dr. Syrus Ware. I'm an assistant professor at the School of the Arts and in Gender and Social Justice here at McMaster University. I'm, particularly interested in intersections between Black trans studies and Black disability studies and the possibilities of using creative practice and research creation to consider justice movements, to think through justice movements, drawing particular inspiration from Black trans and Black disabled, deaf, and mad leadership within these movements. I'm an activist. I've been an organizer for 27 years. And right now, work organizing, I co-founded Black Lives Matter Canada and the Wild Seed Center for Art and Activism, which is an art and activist space in Tuggerandeau in Toronto that brings together Black communities to be able to think through big questions, but also to create work and to respond using research creation. I work large scale portraiture in my own research creation work. Also, I work within performance and speculative fiction, trying to imagine and sort of think through these possibilities as methods in Black studies to imagine freedom, to think through, what Tony Kate Bombera, encouraged us to do about irresistible revolutions, and to sort of world build and prefigure future worlds using, portraiture and using speculative fiction and using activism and performance as methods. So that's what I do. I'm also a parent and very active in my community, and I feel like that's more and more infused in my scholarship.
Yeah. Can I read my part? Is that okay? So I wrote something. This is why so my name is Pablo Herrera Veitia. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Afrosonic Innovations Lab. How everyone is today? Is everyone okay? Hi. So I work at the Afrosonic Innovations Lab, which is part of the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And my research basically concerns or move in two directions. One is directed to or addresses Black lives in Cuba, In these directions, I'm interested in Afro-Cubans and Afro-Cuban histories of the present in post-socialist Cuba. Specifically, my work attempts to outline what it is like to be Afro-Cuban in present-day Havana. It may be obvious that this question is framed after Sylvia Winter, her own What It Is Like to Be Black. In this case, then, it addresses, or basically this question addresses the subject of Cuba's problema negro, or black problem, since or after three particular moments: the fall of global socialism in Havana, or Cuba, actually, sorry, global socialism in 1991, the subsequent legalization of the US dollar as legal tender in Cuba in 1994, and the advent of Cuban or Afro-Cuban rap or hip hop in Cuba from 1995 to 2004. And then the codes, meanings, and functions of Afro-Cuban rap's most recent subgenres as Afro-Cuban ideological formations. With an external scope, this is the other direction. The other direction that basically follows this question of migration and tests whether what I describe as Afro-Cubanity or being Afro-Cuban qualifies or participates in this idea, my critics idea of Black possibility. And this is where I kind of wonder if there is, not only if there is, but what is the place for Afro-Cubans in the Black diaspora now that Cuba is opening up? And what that kind of space looks like, and then the tensions and connections that we may encounter as Afro-Cuban post-socialist women and men with other sort of neoliberal members of the African diaspora. This is kind of the work.
Thank you. One of the things that's striking listening to you all is the different disciplinary and cross-disciplinary positions that we engage. And I think it also raises the question of how do we understand Black studies? And so the next question I want to ask is how do we understand and define Black studies in Canada? And I think that last part also asks us to, and here I'm coming back to and thinking with your responses, because not only are we all complexly related in terms of disciplines, but also geography, right? And sort of geographic focus of our work. So how does diaspora also push on that, in terms of how we think about Black studies in Canada? Maybe I'll start with Syrus.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that, my interest in thinking through how we're defining Black studies in Canada is, really rooted in this idea that, Black, queer, and trans people exist all over this place in Northern Turtle Island, north of the Medicine Line, from coast to coast to coast. So sort of thinking, even though I live in Takarondo, and there's a very large population of Black, queer, and trans people that are shaping scholarship and activism and research creation and creative practice, largely, addressing a broader conversation to the world. But, we exist even in small communities. I'm right now doing an artist residency in Fogo Island in the northmost part of Newfoundland. And we're here, so we exist in these places. I think about Black studies in Canada being necessarily different from elsewhere because we're here in this very specific context. So thinking about how this queer, trans, intersex, disabled, deaf, mad, rich, poor, vast array of intersections of difference within Black communities has been present and shaped Black studies. And so I'm thinking about Courtney McFarlane's insistence that we call names as a way of thinking about what we're doing here. And so I'm thinking about the incredible work of, Maca Diasporic Jukes and the book that was sort of this first coming together of Black, queer, and trans studies here in Canada through creative practice and also through scholarly practice. I'm thinking about Carol Kemper's miscegenation blues. I'm thinking about Nalo Hopkinson's work. I'm thinking about the contemporary scholarship of folks like Robin Menard and Omi Shray Dryden and Letitia Massaquoi and Christopher Smith, who are helping us to think about Black, queer, and trans presence here as something that is shaping an articulation of what it means to be Black in Canada. I think about significant moments that have happened here. My work is so particularly focused on research creation as a tool for liberation, as a strategy of getting towards freer futures. And so I'm thinking about, Dr. Afua Cooper's work and her articulation of the life of Marie Joseph Angelique and how that traces a different genealogy of resistance, perhaps than what's happening south of the Medicine Line or for Black folks in other places. I'm thinking, about Monica Forrester's street-based activism in Takaranjo and what it means for her to be now reintegrating into the archive. I'm thinking about Raven Wings portraying Jackie Shane in the first ever Heritage Minute that focused on a trans person, and it was a Black trans person. So this thinking about how these kind of practices have helped to define and shape a Black studies in Canada that is decidedly queer and trans in its approach and creative in its approach. I think about 2005 when Octavia Butler came up to Toronto, because she was promoting a book, Fledgling, but she sat with Nalo Hopkinson, and Nalo Hopkinson interviewed her in this room full of largely Black, queer, and trans people, talking about the future, talking about a future here, because she had situated a lot of her stories here, including the acorn that they go to in Parable of the Sowers north of the Medicine Line. It's here in Canada. So just thinking about these sort of particular moments. So for me, as a scholar of a Black trans experience and Black trans life here in Northern Turtle Island, my understanding and relationship to Black studies here in Canada is that it is always and will always be a Black, queer, and trans led, narrative. And again, thinking about artists here whose names I also want to call, Debbie Young and Anita Africa, Trey Anthony, Rodney DeVerlis, Sandy Hudson, like all of these artists who are really helping us to think better. We've heard, from some of the other names that were called earlier as well. So that's what I'm sort of thinking about in this moment. I'm thinking about defining a Black trans studies that is imbued with a Black, queer, and trans presence that allows us, therefore, to think forward into a future where Black, queer, and trans people have what they need in order to survive and thrive. So, thank you.
Janelle?
Yeah, I can build on that. Thank you so much, Syrus. I think I'm so happy to be on a panel with you. I've learned so much from you through your scholarly work and our work with the Toronto Freedom School. The ways that we are not only taking the ideas from the academy, but also connecting them in the community, in art, I think is one of the real riches of Black Canadian studies right now. And also thank you for naming the giants on whose shoulders we stand in terms of those intellectual traditions. I won't necessarily repeat what's been said already, but I was fortunate to take a course with Ronaldo Walcott just after Black Like Who came out. And so to me, that was my introduction to Black studies. So I'm glad you also led with the idea of diaspora as a core grounding concept. And for me, that really is the kernel of how we can understand ourselves. And it allows us to think in so many different directions in terms of the in-between, in terms of nostalgia for home, in terms of the both fictitious and real and ancestral ideas of what home is. And the athlete experience that I work on is also germane to this story. That we have our stories of Blackness in Canada so often turn to sport, not only for reasons of discrimination and assumptions of natural athletic superiority, but because of the real opportunities that were created when people came from the US, from the Caribbean. No, they did not arrive in to complete welcome, but certainly the opportunities that were available, that have been available in Canada since the early 1900s for athletic success and for connections with other Black people from other places has allowed for the richness of what it means to be Black in Canada to proliferate. So I'm really excited about the idea of that liminal space that diaspora draws our attention to, the connections to other places, and the understanding of Black studies as more than anti-Black racism studies.
Phiona?
So I'm paying more attention to listening than I'm even thinking about it. I'm going to respond. You know, there's a famous interview with Bob Marley shortly before he died where they asked him what was the difference between performing in Jamaica or performing abroad. And he answered, you know, his answer to the question was, God a earth rightful ruler and him no build no why offense. In Bob Marley's language, it didn't matter where he performed because people were people and all the borders that we have are man-made borders. And so they don't really, you know, in his mind, he was rejecting a lot of that. And so in thinking about Black studies and Black studies in Canada, you know, on the one hand, we operate in a space in Canada where we're not really our neighbors, right? Like to the south. We're a little bit different. And so you find yourself sort of thinking through, who am I outside of my relationship to something else, right? Both rejecting but holding on to that. I think about, you know, the different folks even sitting right here talking about it, talking about what a Black studies could look like and drawing on diaspora as we do that, right? So what would it mean in Canada? What do we center? How do we center ourselves in a way that, you know, is not always in relation to, right? And then how do you even approach a study, a Black studies, without thinking about the centrality of race? Because you know what I mean? Like you want to reject the white gaze. You want to reject how all of that is imposed on us and think about ourselves, not always in relation to, but we're always in relation to. And so even when you make the choice to reject that, it's a choice that you're making that's born from something, right? And so they're always sort of operating simultaneously, race and racism, geography, right? Thinking through our sort of quote unquote multicultural approach to how we live, right? But always knowing that, you know, at any given moment, you could be told that it's the immigrants who bring all their shit from everywhere else and bring it into here that are, you know, the cause of problems, right? So there's always, even when you're trying to think through what this will look like, always things sort of operating outside of how we move.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I'm very new to Canada. So I've just been here for 2 years. So I've looked at critiques of multiculturalism, and I think it's really nice what you said because it sort of segues into sort of my idea or what I think about it. It's this thing of this, like what Walcott says about, you know, multiculturalism as a space of freedom and unfreedom as well, and then Mark Campbell's approach to thinking about the coloniality of multiculturalism as well. But I think for me, someone arriving from a place like Scotland or or Havana via Scotland, I think kind of the questions that I have for Black studies here is where will be the shifts in disciplinary methodologies? How do we continue to produce Black studies that dissenters just writing only or thinking with the community? So I'm interested in ways in which we can listen to the city and how, not exactly sound studies, but ways in which, you know, we hear Black and the ways in which we understand what these places sound like outside of what is just said. So, you know, sonic hegemonies like Toronto's fire, for me, indicate a lot of this kind of the character of the city itself. I'm really interested, for example, in the loudness of the air horn in the city of Toronto and how that makes us think about ways in which we say, okay, this is a plateau or a field where all of us are equal. We share this place of diaspora, but then there's certain things we take for granted. And there's all the ways in which power exerts itself outside of what is just said, outside of the land acknowledgement. And I wonder in what way Black Studies then produces a counter to these other ways, or at least nonverbal ways of exerting power.
I mean, that question about practices, what are the practices of Black Studies, I think is a useful one to hold as part of this conversation, right? And I think it resists a sort of understanding of Black Studies as that thing that is already constituted within universities, within institutions, but to think about it as a practice, right? As a verb, as an ongoing thing. And I think that's a useful thing to hold. In building on that, I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the traditions that you draw on in your own practice. This panel has already been so rich in citational practice, right? We've been talking about some of the folks that have informed our thinking. And maybe we can also add to that or layer on that. What are some of the ways in which, what are some of the models that we have for doing Black Studies?
I can start now. Is that okay? So thinking in these ways of, I think the question also has like, how broad could our approaches or our genealogies are to really include the voices of our communities? I'm interested, for example, in thinking through Ifa divination as a way of creating a theoretical framework that's outside what we understand as academic work, but that has the community at the center, and the relationship between different voices from the community to then produce an idea about how a particular Odu of Ifa tells us about archives of, not only the people's archives, but also rap Cubano archives or hip hop archives in general, but then all the ways in which Ifa or Orisha divination, Orisha devotion allows us to then understand why sound is so important in understanding or thinking in terms of, or rethinking Black Studies. And why approaches to, or thinking through these approaches that include our communities directly gave us an amplitude that's outside citation, but it's basically in this process of engaging community all the time. So I think that citation is really important because then we acknowledge those who we stand on, but at the same time, there's also a practice of dynamism that happens with our communities in which we engage or speak from my mother's kitchens that I think is really important. So in that sense, I think I'm not trying to. I think what I'm worried about is that there's certain a prioris that are behind the question of citing other people that repeat certain colonialities, and when we speak as a community, we say, "Oh, my aunt said," or my mom said this, but does that qualify as bibliographic, or is it So in what ways is that really sound studies, or is it most about, like you said, is it about the process itself? No, going back to Herrera Broadbridge, just to cite her again. So yes, I'll just leave it to that.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that because I'm working on a project that is helping me to think through this question of the practice. I was invited to share about the Ideas Research Lab that I run and the ways in which it is, the person described it to me as a diasporic, decolonial, Black Crip lab. And I said, is that what I'm doing? So yes, I'll come and talk to you about that. But then I had to think about, what do I actually do in this research lab? And it is all of those things, but it is about the practice. And so I really draw from that kitchen table kind of metaphor. And I've learned, Cindy Godet is an Indigenous scholar, a Métis scholar from Alberta who writes about visiting methodology. And in hearing her explain the ways that the visiting is the thing, I thought, we do that at my kitchen table all the time. When me and my aunt are visiting, that is part of how I learned to be a professor. How I learned to do Black studies was through those kitchen table conversations was through the referencing our grandmothers and their grandmothers. It's through understanding how our hair shows up in our research and our sport and our, the ways that we are being is in relation to others and in relation to each other. So I think that idea of a visiting methodology, a kitchen table, Ubuntu, I am who I am because we are who we are, understanding that relationality is a core aspect of the practice, and it shows up everywhere that we go. And so I think learning to be explicit about that, I do think that the grandmothers and our dreams are a citational practice, and that we need to bring those into the academy in order to legitimize them, use our positions and our not just writing practices, but speaking and art and research creation in order to transform the ways that Blackness is understood.
Thank you. Could we hear from Syrus and then Phiona?
And when I did the books Marvelous Crowns and Queering Urban Justice, we were really looking at this idea of archiving the unarchivable. And for me, so much of what informs my research, or what is part of my research is in these fragments, in those moments spoken outside of the party, outside of the function, where you're standing on the street and where community is coming together and where you're talking about life and where you're sort of moving forward plans. It's those moments sitting on the stoop, on Church Street where community is coming together. So, the sourcing of information, sometimes comes from a bit of a different source. So I just love that, this idea of the citations can come directly from community because our research is embedded in there. And then thinking about, again, artists and people who are working in research creation who have helped to anchor some of our art and activism together. And I'm thinking of Rodney DeVerlis's incredible work, In Your Eyes, The Sparkle of Gunpowder, which was a dance work. I think it was their first big performance in Taekwondo or in Ontario. And it was in 2017. And I had curated a program at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and they were in it. And this was this work that they created. And it directly connected this experience of driving while Black, the targeted policing and police brutality that was affecting Black communities, where we were seeing, all of these people being killed and affected by targeted policing. And it, inserted a Black jazz, Black Canadian jazz narrative into the strike, and was this dance work that brought through and tied into direct action and organizing and activism. And it was this profound work that was this dance work that absolutely, allowed us to think about Blackness here in a very different way. And then the last work I would mention would be Cara Springer's incredible Small Matter of Engineering, which was that large billboard work that was put up in front of her school that just simply said, white people, do something, that was put up in 2016. And just how these artists who were really helping us to kind of push the dial in terms of what we were sort of thinking about and how we were seeing what we were seeing.
Sorry, can we hear from Phiona and then?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking through, well, kind of what everybody has been talking about. My own research is looking at community organizations and how Black communities impact school reform, for want of a better term. Now, a big part of that is sort of working with or thinking about how communities theorize the Black experience or Black experiences in Canada. And then thinking about, how that informs what we do or don't do in schools. What does it mean for us to know, understand our experiences? How do we leverage what, as a people who've been dominated for so long, like how do we continue to live, to survive, to thrive? How do we subvert spaces? And then thinking about, Jamaicans say, and everything good for eat, good for talk. There's some things that we think about on our own that for us, it doesn't mean that that is something you share outside of that. So what does it mean for me as both a student and a member, how do I avoid sort of cannibalizing our ways of being to make it into something? And then when you make it into something, where do you share it with this idea of everything good for eat, good for talk, right? Like, and so there's always different things sort of operating all the time. We don't have to say everything. It doesn't have to be published. It doesn't mean we don't know it, right? So how do we continue to live and know that? And how do we continue to share these ways of us just living with other young Black children, right? Particularly when so many of us are just trying to make it through. And we have our kids who are experiencing things and who may, they feel it in their bodies, but may or may not understand what is operating. Right? Like, how do we build on that, and how do we continue to share? How do we continue to move in ways that will be protective, right? At least of ourselves. And so I'm just thinking about all of that as we're talking. On the one hand, how do we demonstrate that, yes, we are theorizing, or grandmothers theorize, right? Like, how do we do that? But take out of our heads this idea that if it doesn't exist in a particular book, or if it doesn't exist in the academy, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and the sort of question that underlies it as well is like, who is our Black Studies for, right? How can it not just be for the institution, but for our communities? There was something you wanted to respond to,
I think
Pablo.
that this is. Thank you for that, Phiona. I think that there's a question. It's a question of the orientation of the work we do, and then the other part is just the question of the genre itself. In terms of, I've seen in other places, people talk about or address, say, for example, Afro-Cuban studies, and you think about Afro-Cuban studies in terms of literature, cinema, and history, right? And then those genres are important because you do get to understand the intellectual aspects of Afro-Cuban lives. But then Afro-Cuban people, let's just say at the bottom, speak about themselves and relate and produce historiographies of themselves through different genres that leave this major gap here. I think Phiona is talking about that. So the idea is, I feel like the idea of producing these ideas of books is important, following certain literary traditions and writing traditions, in the case, again, Afro-Cubans. But how do we bridge that gap? And this is why, again, I think that things like thinking through music, thinking through sound, thinking through, religious practices, spiritualities. Not exactly saying, well, you guys are spiritual people. Everyone is. But I think that there's a way in which, I don't know if the idea is to bridge that gap, but in which if we're actually orienting ourselves to speak with our communities, we may need to use other genres to really reach out to them and engage them.
It's making me think about your own work with Copperis, and I'm sure I'm not saying the word right, but just looking at how we've been able to communicate knowledges or ways of being.
Thank you.
In different forms. So not necessarily as a written word, but in dance and martial arts.
Exactly. Dance, language, music, and the vernacularization, like the ways that we are translating and reinterpreting and knowing with our bodies. I think all of that can be captured within this canon of the theorizing of Black studies.
And this connects to what Syrus was saying earlier about the ways in which artists in Toronto have been a major part of a public discourse about Blackness, and how do we recall that in our thinking about Black studies. Before we open it up to questions, I just want to, one final thing that we might think about or talk together about is what might be possible in this moment, and what does this current moment make possible or constrain. Syrus, do you want to go?
I think we're in a moment of profound possibility. And I think that What we saw with the uprisings of 2020 and the uprisings of 2016, but particularly with the uprisings of 2020, was a real galvanizing and sort of catalytic moment for a lot of people. There were people who had been involved in organizing for generations, and there were people who were coming to the movement for the first time. And we saw a lot of people quite literally rolling up their sleeves and touching change, and as Octavia Butler encouraged us to do, and sort of getting involved in large and small ways. And part of what that involvement, largely galvanized around was this idea of abolition, which was this radical idea that we could just build the kind of world that we wanted to live in, which shouldn't be a really radical idea. But I feel like right now it's palpable. There are enough people and enough possibility models out there of successful examples that people can say, oh, hold on a minute, maybe there is a bit of dream time possible in my life. Maybe I can imagine forward into a different kind of future. Maybe we can prefigure and start to live as if we're already there. And I'm seeing more and more people believing that. And I think that it's not a coincidence that we're in this moment which has seen a real resurgence of interest in speculative fiction. We're in this moment where speculative fiction is on every channel and in so much of our world. And these are examples that are helping us to practice the future. Adrienne Marie Brown talks about this speculative fiction as a way to practice the future, but these are examples that help us to imagine all of these different kinds of futures and then say, well, which one do I want to live in, and how do I kind of get there? So right now it feels like a very exciting moment of possibility. And I don't say that in a sort of falsely optimistic or rooted in sort of some sort of sense of disconnected utopia, because I think that hope is not the same as optimism. But I do think that there is something happening here that is propelling us forward into something different. And I think that it's this crisis around racial justice, this crisis around climate, this question around policing, prisons, and carceral logics that is coming to a head at the end of late stage capitalism. So we're in this moment right now where there is a sort of as I say, a bit of a catalytic force propelling us forward, and this is a moment of possibility. So we've also seen some of the seeds that our ancestors have planted fruiting into some beautiful trees, and we're harvesting some of that fruit now. So that also is nourishing us forward into a different kind of future. So right now, I would absolutely say this is a moment to dream into anything that you've been wanting or wondering, maybe I could, should I possibly, or what if I considered. Now is the time to just go for that, because we are in a moment of profound fecundity. The soil is rich and nourished and ready for what is coming. So change is possible. I mean, this is Octavia Butler, Pablo was written in about 2024. This is the moment when things really start to change. And I think that, with the AMOX potentially, the Atlantic Meridian Ocean Current potentially collapsing as early as 2025, literally things are about to change in a profound way regardless. So why not, let's, push it towards the kinds of change that we're hoping to see happen.
Janelle?
One exciting thing, just to build on that, is around what the moment in 2020 did in our academies in terms, and the Scarborough Charter as well, in terms of building momentum for positions, for postdoctoral fellowships, for graduate students with Black identities and heritage. So the idea that we are now growing in numbers rapidly, and with the cluster hires that are happening across Canada, I think that is also linked to everything that Syrus was just mentioning in terms of how we can dream bigger, do more, teach the next generation, and build together. I also agree, there's profound possibilities right now.
Okay. Really quick responses to that question.
Okay. I don't know if I can be quick.
We have 5 minutes.
I'm just thinking, I love the idea of possibilities. And as a people, we've always had to dream about what that means. We've never been able to sort of think outside of that. We're always, sort of thinking about how we can move. With that said, I think, living in the present also means something. it is important for us to think about, now I feel like I've lost my train of thought. It is good that we're having cluster hires. I don't know that I trust the academy. I think they're always going to try to put people in positions that they think will aid and abet white supremacy. I don't know if they're going to necessarily do that. Having said that, I think I shouldn't always live in despair, and I should probably lean into the activism of people who've always stood up to domination, and Black people have done that for a long time. So maybe I'll look into that as a possibility.
Yeah, I think for me the question is in this idea of possibility. What are we taking for granted? And I love the fact you spoke patois, and you can say that decir las palabras en español. I was actually speaking to Maria Luisa Barros earlier about the fact that there's a particular hegemony in language that we tend to not think when we think about Black studies. This tension of having to understand everything in English, or drawing ideas in English, or defining ways of protesting in English only. How much do we know about the ways in which people protest in Portuguese in Brazil or in Cuba, or how much people do we understand about the way Afro-Cubans protest in Spanish? And so I think that this question of possibility or posibilidad necesita the fact that we also understand these registers, right? And I think it's all to talk about this one sort of Black registers, but can we open it up to other ways in which, when we have conversations, they're not just in English? Because then we destabilize and break the colonial barriers that we somehow think with without really. I'll leave it to that.
Yeah, and that's an important point to make. We've talked about the ways in which, we need to destabilize disciplines. We need to think about the inside and the outside of the academy. And that question of language is a colonial legacy that we also need to work against in sort of reimagining Black studies. Alpha?
Hello. Testing? Okay. I know we're doing the impossible by bringing all these people here with, I know, we're gonna somehow make it work, but the idea with today is that the conversations are building upon each other, so we will have opportunities to continue to be in conversation with each other. We've got about 5 minutes left of this panel, and so I think we have enough time for 2 questions. We'll take the questions first together, and then use whatever time we can to respond to them. Thank you. If there are no questions, I know the people on, okay, there we go.
Hi, good morning. Pleasure to be here and to listen to your talks. I guess, as I'm part of the new cohort hire, and, I identify as a 3rd+ generation Black Canadian, on my dad's side, and, one of the things I had to kind of confront with all my life is that we're not represented in institutions, right? And so you talked about, diaspora, and, I think which I think is, a defining sort of element of the Black experience, but I also wonder if, how do we combine that with historical experiences and historical Black communities in Canada, because I think by paying attention to that, we may get some greater purchase on what is specific about Canadian Blackness and Canadian anti-Black racism, and so, you were saying, for example, we are different from the US, but actually we're not that much. I mean, the people are different, but the practices are very much the same, right? So up until the 1960s, Canada had a kind of informal system of Jim Crow, right? Where, Black kids could not go to, for example, the mainstream schools until the 1960s in Halifax and in some places, Ontario. So how do we, incorporate, that multiplicity, right? That gets us thinking not just about sort of how we bring in, great diversity in perspectives and experience, but what is also very specific to, Canadian history of racism.
Does anyone else want to get a question in? We have space for one more question. That's okay. Let me just invite folks to respond to that if, yeah.
Thank you for your comments. I think you're bringing up a really important point. And one of the things that has emerged in some of my research is around the experience, especially in Halifax, with many generations of Black Canadians. And one of the things that brings their experience to light is in conversation with newcomers. It is in conversation with those who have come from Sudan or elsewhere, or non-Black Canadians in those spaces. So I think diaspora is still a useful heuristic to examine what is Canadian, meaning being here for many generations, and recognizing that even those Haligonians have ancestors who are from elsewhere. So yes, I hear your point, absolutely. We need to stop thinking about newness and the immigrant story and go back many generations. And still, Canada is in conversation with Indigenous stories and those stories from elsewhere.
I think just very quickly, for example, the work that we do with Black students and Black literatures in English, there's a core text that we use a lot called New Daughters of Africa, which is the sequel to Daughters of Africa. And each of these anthologies have more than 200 Black women writers from around the world. So when we think about how we tell our own stories, you can see the breadth of Blackness through the eyes of Black women in essays and short stories and poems and excerpts from novels and so on, in all sorts of languages, about all sorts of topics. I think something like that for me helps me to work with students to see just how broad and expansive our lives are. And so something like that brings into conversation a lot of what Irene just asked, right? Like, it's how do you not close off things so it looks like we're just one, this or not? So we're still common, but.
I mean, and if I could interject, I mean, I think that's one of the things that is exciting about Black studies as it emerges in Canada, that I don't think we've had to choose between these things, but that they've always existed in tension, in contention, and in relation to each other. You know, and I'm thinking here about those fierce debates in the late 1990s between folks like Georgia Clark, Ronald Walcott, you know, and there are ways in which, you know, they can be thought of as, you know, kind of, you know, in a much more micro way, right, in terms of the interpersonal. But I think what at the heart of it is a struggle and also a multiplying of how we do Black studies. And, you know, I think in learning from that, you know, how might we think about Black studies emerging in Canada as always already being multiple, as always already being capacious, as always already being, you know, contentious, but there's also expansiveness in that contention, right? That we don't need to we don't need to articulate from the same positions, right? And what are the uses of sort of like learning from, you know, those lessons, while also thinking about how we as scholars enter the debates, right? Yeah. Okay, so I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. Join me in thanking the panelists, and we're looking forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you. That was very nice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cummings and the entire panel one. We appreciate you. Thank you. A round of applause for them as we continue. That was quite an informative session. And I believe that as researchers, we ask questions and then our question leads to more questions. And that's the essence of these sessions today, for us to educate ourselves and just think about more things to consider.